Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us this morning. We really appreciate you being here and hope you've had a chance to have some breakfast. I'm Jennifer Bachner. I direct the Master of Science in Government Analytics program as well as the certificate program here at Johns Hopkins University. We are, of course, very happy to have you. And the purpose of this event, and of the forum in general, and Jeff will speak to this as well, is to really form a community of people who are interested in analytics and how the public sector is using analytics. So we hope that today's event is a discussion. I think the speaker is happy to have questions throughout. So we very much encourage your participation and questions. Welcome as well to the people who are joining us on the live stream. We're very happy to have you, and please submit your questions in the little chat box below the screen. We encourage you to tweet about the GAB forum using the hashtag GAB forum. You can log into the wireless using the option, because I know we're in a bit of a dead space when it comes to cell service here. We will be recording the event and posting the event on the website about 24 to 48 hours afterwards. So if you'd like to share the event with one of your colleagues, we certainly encourage you to do so. That's about all I have to say. Thank you so much again for being here, and I will let my colleague from REI System, Jeff Myers, introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Jen. Just for reference, the microphone I'm holding actually goes directly to our online audience. Doesn't do anything in the room, but it helps so that the folks who aren't able to be here in person have a chance to hear from you. First, I want to thank Jen at Johns Hopkins. I think it's great that there is a program in government analytics that helps advance the use of careful thought analysis, data, and such in informing both policy and management decisions in our government. I think that's important. I really appreciate the fact that Johns Hopkins is doing this. Analytics are important to REI Systems as well. We provide support to a variety of civilian agencies at the federal level as well as state and local agencies in helping improve the efficiency and effectiveness of government programs through technology, and analytics are a big part of that. I do want to emphasize what Jen said. The purpose of these events is for you to have a chance to kind of learn from each other within the analytics community, learn about successes, learn about places where you haven't kind of quite figured out how to crack a problem, and get ideas and suggestions from people who are here in the room. I would encourage you to ask questions. I think they're always a much more interesting event when we have a good discussion going back and forth. And no holds barred, I encourage our speakers to ask questions of audience members too, because there are often audience members that have some knowledge or interest in a situation. It's a little harder to do with the folks online for us to ask you questions, but we would encourage you when you have a chance to come in person. Let me now introduce Sarah Ellis-Peed from the Office of Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Protection at the Department of Homeland Security. She spent the past 9 years at the Department of Homeland Security in previous roles working with consulting firms and with the state of Massachusetts. She has, I often ask our speakers, well, tell a little bit about kind of your educational background, because people are occasionally interested in kind of how is it that their career path ended up in a senior position such as this. And after her education at Harvard in Russian literature, she has made trips to Russia, although it's been a long time back, she assures me, for security clearance purposes and for the uncertainty of current U.S.-Russia relations. After that, she went to chasing kids. So we thank you very much for coming and look forward to your thoughts here and lessons and experience in making analytics accessible to folks, especially in a community and in a place where some of them can't all be shared publicly. Thank you for joining us, Sarah, and we'll look forward to listening to your presentation. As Jen mentioned, Sarah will be happy to answer questions throughout the presentation if you have them. If you do, please say something and I'll bring the microphone to you so folks online can hear.
Thank you, Jeff and Jen, and thank you all for getting up early. Just to add on to Jeff's comment about questions, if you happen to be a member of the media, we don't think there are any, but if you happen to be, please let me know, because I told my illustrious DHS overseers that I would not have press here when they agreed to do this, so I want to be extra careful about any questions like that. So thank you for getting up to come and participate in today's discussion. I'm very interested to hear from you all. I was realizing and talking to some of you in the room that I may be less technical than some of you in the room, and I actually think that's really good. What I want to talk about today is the importance of making analysis useful and how we can link it to decision makers. And so I think it's really important to have a variety of perspectives or a variety of skill sets as we talk about these analytic questions so that we can ultimately arrive at useful analysis. Looking forward to your questions. I am also a big believer in community building, so I'm excited to be here today. So as was stated, my name is Sarah Ellis, and I'm privileged to have recently completed a detail as the Acting Deputy Director for the Office of Cyber and Infrastructure Analysis. Just this week, I have to correct a little bit. I've moved over to a sister organization, the Office of Infrastructure Protection. I left the title and everything the same since literally Monday was my new title, and I didn't feel like that was worth correcting. I will serve as a senior advisor. Both organizations are within the National Protection and Programs Directorate, or NPPD. Since NPPD, as a name, probably tells you nothing about the organization that I work in, let me elucidate a little bit. So we focus on domestic infrastructure from within the U.S. from all hazards, with a strong focus on adversarial. Can you hear me?
Apparently some folks on the line might be having a hard time.
That's okay.
See if we can try. Let me just switch that into this state.
All right, hopefully that will be better. With a strong focus on adversarial and cyber attacks. The examples that I'm going to draw on today are focused on this mission space, but I'm confident, and I'm particularly confident, having had some quick conversations in the room, that we all share similar challenges. So I have to warn you in starting out that I'm just recently back from training. I went down to the Federal Executive Institute, or FEI, where I hope many of you have been or will have a chance to be. It was truly a great opportunity to step out of the office, to reflect, relax, and gain perspective on our usually frantic lives. You may think that sounds innocuous, but one of the things we did at training is learn how to improve our communications. We were lectured on best practices, we were videotaped, we broke up into small groups and took turns presenting to each other so that we could each receive feedback from the others. And lo and behold, immediately upon return, here I am making a presentation. If you find yourself counting ums or other filler words, noticing odd mannerisms, or who knows what else you might clue in on, please know that I am also thinking, why am I doing that, and why can't I be exactly like that trainer was? So that was just sort of an interesting timing for me. But moving beyond all the little distractions of presentation, I'm hoping that I can share some examples of what we at DHS are working on, and I'm eager to hear from you regarding shared challenges. When Jeff asked me to participate in the breakfast series, I at first thought that I wanted to talk about visualization of data, hence some of the title for the talk. But as I begin to prepare, I realized that the planning and organizing constructs that surround analysis are really the foundation that get us to solid visualization of data. And that if I jumped to visualization immediately, I was going to miss the more critical piece, in my opinion. So I hope you'll bear with me as I use visualization as a lens through which to view the broader challenge of creating useful analysis. The key that I want to talk about today is the importance of understanding why we are doing analysis before we ever undertake any analytic work, and then integrating that understanding from project initiation through data presentation and visualization, and then on into real action. I'm going to start off today with talking about the framework for how I think about constructing an analytic product, walk you through a few examples of products that have worked well and products that have worked less well, and wrap up with lessons learned. As I was preparing for this morning, I realized that this is probably a lecture. It's a lecture not because I want you all to sit and listen and not to participate. Rather, it's a lecture in the sense that I'm frequently lecturing my children. I tell them things they probably already mostly know, and that's what you will probably hear. I remind them to wash their hands, tie their shoes, get their homework in on time. They know these things, but I hope for them, just as I hope for you today, that by revisiting things you might already know, they can be fresh in your mind, and as a community, we can be encouraged to implement best practices. Okay, now to dig into the meat of the discussion. Like a good analyst, I like to start with my theory for how we think we can best approach our analytic work. I'll start with my end goal. My belief, and Rick knows this because he's in my office sometimes and I lecture him on this, and our analytic approach is founded on the expectation that our analysis must make a difference in the world. At NPPD, we are not a science organization, and our analysis is with the sole purpose of contributing directly to the mission of securing U.S. citizens and property. If we conduct cutting-edge analysis with novel data that is visualized immaculately, but it sits on a shelf or in someone's email, we have failed. At NPPD, successful analysis is useful analysis. It might inform a policy position, identify a new cyber attack tactic, or assist in setting priorities in the face of limited resources. The type of impact can vary widely, but it must be useful. In my experience, there are two variables that determine if the analysis will be useful. One, was the user involved in the process, and two, are the results accessible to the user once complete. User involvement is absolutely critical to every analytic product that I've worked on. Strong involvement generally leads to a positive outcome, whereas limited or no involvement leads to a negative outcome. Strong user involvement to me looks like the following, if I can, the agenda. There we go. Okay. So first, the project addresses a significant gap within the user's portfolio with a specific analytic question clearly articulated. Ideally, the gap is substantial enough that it will spur consistent attention throughout the analytic process. We know what we hope to do with the user before we even start. Second, the user actively participates in scoping the analytic problem from the very beginning. This means that the user drives the problem statement. The analytic effort can't be one that is already underway and a new use case is tacked on. That rarely works, in my opinion. When there are too many uses for a product, there are often no uses for a product. We at DHS are moving increasingly toward bespoke analytics based on common analytic platforms that are flexible and data sets that capture a lot of varieties, but that then can be molded to capture the needs of the specific decision. Third, the user is engaged routinely on all substantive questions of methodology, data, and related updates to scope. In my opinion, this is the most important step because it's the one we most often overlook. Very often I have seen projects that start off on solid footing, but then the user is not involved in the analytic work itself. For everyone that does analysis, and I know all of you in the room do, you know that in the course of the project, the analytic team will need to make decisions about which data to use, how to update the planned methodology, if unexpected data limitations or characteristics arrive, where to cut corners, and where to prioritize to ensure an on-time product, and numerous other modifications that occur along the way. When the user is not involved in these decisions, we often find that the decisions made by the well-intentioned analytic team have scoped out major aspects of the analysis, and the final product is of limited utility. I've seen this so many times that I cannot count. And so we are really focusing heavily at DHS on creating more of an IPT process that is continuous throughout. I think it's the only way we're going to get utility.
Sarah?
Yep.
In the sense of trying to kind of engender a little bit of conversation as we go along, what would you do when you find that there seems likely to be a decision made on an important topic and it may be made with just subjective judgment, and you think, hey, some sort of data or analysis would result in a much better decision, but the user hasn't really asked for that? How would you address that?
Obviously, the answer is it depends. It depends on who the user is and what the decision is and how quickly I can produce the analysis. I think if I can walk in quickly and say, here's something that might be of use, here it is, and it's appropriate and complete, that might be successful. But more often in those cases, when you produce a final product and hand it to a user, they don't understand the data, they don't know the methodology, and they're going to meet you with questions. Right? So they're going to say, well, how do I know I can trust this? Where did you get this data? And you end up having discussions that argue about the data itself, and you don't actually get often to the findings that the data suggests. I'm sure that's a common experience. I see some folks nodding, where you end up debating the product rather than the solution and the decision at hand. So you can try, but it's definitely not optimal. Definitely not optimal. Yeah. Did that answer your question? Great. Okay, so then the fourth thing here, the user is very clear about how they need the data presented and can link the presentation back to the original analytic questions. We're going to look in a few minutes at some example graphics and talk more about this one. Without these four elements of user involvement, I frankly have not seen a successful analytic product. We do what we just talked about. We argue about the process, the data, the assumptions that were made, and rather than focus on the question at hand. Unfortunately, our decision makers and their proxies are often overtapped and unable to spend the time that is needed to fully utilize the analytic resources available to them. As analysts, we can help them. So one of the reasons that I think I'm most interesting as a part of this community is because I've spent time working on policy questions. So my most recent detail was overseeing an analytic group, and my original job at DHS was doing analysis, but in between I worked at the DHS Office of Policy, and I've also done a lot of work with the PCCs and the other interagency policy committees, and so I understand in a way that most analysts don't why we are doing the analysis. I think that is critical so that we can start to bridge those gaps. So we're really working hard to try and build in rotations, build in additional trainings to get analysts into the decision maker world. Okay, as analysts we can also help by establishing clear project commitment expectations up front We need to let everyone know that meetings and reviews will be needed and that participation is a requirement for a successful effort. So I have obviously my remarks written out, but I'll do a little asides as I think of interesting things. So one of the things that we have done with this Office of Cyber and Infrastructure Analysis is we have an annual analytic call for projects. We go out to the subcomponents within NPPD and say, hey, what analysis are you going to need this year? We're going to put together our analytic agenda. What we're finding is that a year later, if we do this annual process, we have this list that we're going to do. A year later, nobody cares about those things anymore. Things have changed, decisions have moved on. That is too long of a process, and so we have to redo our requirements process to be much more flexible, and we're thinking, maybe every 6 months, maybe even quarterly, as well as reserving some resources so that as these ad hoc analytic requirements come in, we're more nimble to do that. So we're still working through exactly what that's going to look like, but I think as we have more clear project commitment expectations, that will help, because there will be just kind of routine engagement with some of the people that ultimately need to be the users. Okay, so since I know all of this, how is it working out for me? I'm sure that it is going great, right? I know all of these answers. So I've seen mixed results, frankly, which is some of how I've come to my current approach. I'm going to walk you through a few projects that I've been involved in and draw out some examples and lessons learned. Okay, so here's example one. Okay, so what you're seeing on the slide is an example of the final outcome from a large risk assessment that I was involved in. Before I walk you through the graph, there are two notes. First, I was and remain extremely proud of the team that worked on this project. They did Herculean work, and I don't want anything I say today to reflect poorly on them in any way. Primarily, I'm criticizing myself. It was my job to make this successful. Second, and importantly, the data here is not real. That's very important, both to avoid classification issues and because it's easier not to worry about clearing data for release to you all, and because the point is about the format and use more so than the findings. So don't interpret this as anything other than me making X's on a graph, which is literally what I did. So what is it that you're looking at, this graphic? The y-axis represents the frequency of the risk events that we assessed, with logarithmic increases in frequency as you go up on the chart. The x-axis is the direct economic consequences of the risk events. Note that this is direct economic consequence only because of the variation in the way in which indirect economic consequences are measured across the different risk events. It was methodologically infeasible to represent the complete economic consequences of different events in a single graph. The crosses on the graph show the range of uncertainty for the frequency and consequences of the different risk events, so each of the crosses is one of the events. You'll note that on my graph the uncertainty is quite large. You might also note that there are 3 different types of risk events that the events are grouped into, using color to distinguish these different categories. Finally, the text in the lower left hand of the portion makes a point about not assuming correlation between frequency and consequence, particularly for risk events that have very different data sources and methodologies for the frequency and consequence. So my question for you, how do you think this was received by a decision maker, and was it used? I bet you can tell by looking at it, right? What decision maker, there's only one decision maker I've ever met who looked at this and had any idea what in the world to do with this. So I think the team did great work. It's very interesting. I personally use a lot of this information in my own head as I'm racking and stacking risks. I don't think that beyond me and a few of the people that worked on it has ever made an impact in the real world. So why is that, and is this then a successful product? I think if we were to go back and look at the metrics within the department that year, probably yes, we said check, we met the deadline, we handed this in to the NSC, we did everything we needed to do, but is it a success? If you remember my own personal bar, did it make a big change in the real world? The answer is no. I don't think this was a successful project. I love this project, but I do not think it was a successful project. It's far too technical. I've briefed project versions of this graph many times, and people find it interesting, but ultimately it doesn't hit my criteria for user engagement that we talk about, and it's just not used. People have walked out of meetings and that was great, I love this. No one ever uses it because they were not involved. The core challenge for this project was that the user in the analytic question was never defined. When I look at this graph and think about how it could be used, I imagine that someone with complete jurisdiction over the Homeland Security space could potentially look at this and make determinations about prioritizing across risk events. I think that was the original intent. But there are 2 problems. The first is that such a person doesn't exist. The Secretary of DHS has a lot of that authority, but it's definitely shared with law enforcement entities and other federal entities, and the budget and organizational structures within DHS don't support prioritization like this across mission areas. There's a couple of other folks in DHS in the room, and you know that we all create our budgets in a silo. We create our priorities, our policy priorities, our operational priorities in a silo. It goes up to DHS. It is virtually unheard of to make large trade-off decisions across those different silos. So there's really not a decision space where something like this could be used. So, analysis, great, but where does it go? Second, even if we had a clear user who could make use of the data, the risk information captured is our as-is risk. That is, it looks at our current risk picture with all of the current investments in place, but it doesn't capture any detailed information about how those investments have contributed to the risk picture. So as a made-up example to clarify what I'm talking about, we would not want to conclude that flood risk was a lesser budget priority than other risks based just on this chart. It could be that our current level of investment has just appropriately brought down the risk, and that any decrease in prioritization or funding would cause a large jump in risk. So because you don't have the underlying data behind the programs that contribute to what we're seeing here, it's very difficult to use this. From this experience, we were reminded that user involvement is paramount, and it was lacking here for a lot of reasons. I'm going to try and keep this generic, so I'm not going to go into all the reasons there, not fully our fault. But really, I think solidified for me that you can do the best analysis in the world, and it's unlikely to make change unless you focus on the front end. The team did great work, and in the end, it didn't much matter. Okay, so how do we learn and move forward? Well, as a result of my learning, I try to spend a lot of time up front on projects to make sure to map out customer needs. I'm going to walk you through another project that I think we did a little better. Okay. So these slides address the performance measurement framework that we have developed and are continuing to build upon in NPPD. There's going to be about 3 slides that focus on this work. I didn't actually edit the material for this presentation. I lifted it from existing material because I think it's important to see how embedded the why part is into what we're doing analytically, and how much effort has been spent on establishing the framework before we get to the data and the analytics. So what you see on this slide is a value chain that we worked through to serve as the foundation for our metrics. I know that metrics might not always be seen as hard analytics, but at DHS, we produce security, not widgets. And measurement is actually a very complex undertaking for us. We're constantly challenged by the need to prove that the reason something nasty hasn't happened is because our programs are doing good work. Okay, so I've broken out here. So what we've done here is break out the different aspects of our work that we might want to measure. We've broken the work down into the column headers, activities and outputs, audience, etc. And below that we have a short phrase that provides more context to the title, and below that we bullet out the type of metrics that we will need to measure that aspect of our work. The idea is that if we can produce meaningful metrics for each of the bullets, we'll be able to produce a comprehensive picture of how our work is going. Note that at the top of the slide, above the table, the originating intent and the target audiences are identified. We put this material together with our senior-most leadership. We sat down with them over the course of a couple of days to hash this out, spending several hours. On the next few slides, I want to show some examples of what the outputs look like as a result of the process. Here you see the data for different types of voluntary engagements that we have had with members of the critical infrastructure community. A lot of what we do is go out and have capacity building engagements. It could be a specific technical engagement. It could be assessing the risk at someone's particular asset or system. It could be something like an active shooter drill where we're training people what to do should there be an active shooter in their facility. So those are the kinds of things that we're trying to measure here. We're primarily meeting with owners and operators of infrastructure assets and systems, so it could also include state and local government personnel. The colors in the little pie charts show you the relative percentage of the different types of engagements, with some focus on active shooters, some focus on preparedness, etc. And we've determined to break it down geographically. The text at the top of the slide gives the total number of engagements through the year and the total number of participants. This is not what the slide looked like originally. So we're going to talk a little bit through this, but heavy stakeholder engagement in what data they want and how it's presented. On this slide, we dig a little deeper into one of the engagement types that appeared on the prior slide. Here we're including the survey responses from the participants and breaking out more detail on how many workshops were held and how many participants attended each workshop. There is some narrative text that captures accomplishment data that is easier in text without forcing it into a quantitative depiction. And in the circle on the right-hand side on that lower part, we give more detail on who those individuals were that attended. I know it's hard to see kind of the data details, but that's not really my point. So now for this example, do you think this is being used? Yes, of course you do, because I already told you, right? I told you at the beginning that our senior leadership was heavily involved right from the start. They are begging for these outputs. I've been told this is one of my top priorities as I return to infrastructure protection. They want this. We hold quarterly review meetings with our senior leadership team. We go over the data, and most importantly, we don't talk about the data or where it came from. We're talking about what we need to do as business changes as a result of the data. And we're able to get there because they know where the data came from. They're able to opine on it. They engage with it regularly. They submit some of the raw data themselves. And so there's a much more community effort around it, and we're able to move past analytics into decisions. At each meeting, we accept additional feedback on what future metrics we need and how we can better assemble our presentations so that directly answers the question that leadership is working through. I have to say there is one young lady in particular that runs this program, and she is a hot commodity. I mean, she works crazy hours because people are always coming to her. I need to know this, I need to know that, tell me about this, how can we expand here? And she is doing yeoman's work because everybody loves this. At first, I would say it was tough because people don't want to always be measured. They want to sort of hide, and maybe some of their things that aren't going so well don't come to the surface as much. But I think as people have become involved, and it's been such a community effort, it's really been extremely fruitful for us. So we're continuing to work on this. I think some of the more advanced, if you remember the value chain things about outcomes as opposed to outputs, we're still working on that for sure. But I feel really, really comfortable with the process, and there's huge buy-in. So going back to my criteria for user involvement, this project is hitting it out of the park. The user initiated this project, they saw the need, they were engaged in the value chain at the beginning that set up the scope, and they provide regular input throughout, including as it relates to data presentation. It's going great. The graphics are not particularly fancy, but they are accessible, and they focus on the material that matters to decision makers. So obviously we know how to do this the right way, but we still as a community have largely not learned our lesson about how to involve users and present data in a useful manner. I checked in on the status of a few analytic tools as I was preparing the slides, and one of them is working on implementation of an analytic interface that looks like this. This is great. If you are an analyst and you have a lot of time on your hands, it lets you determine which sectors you want to look at. You can make some assumptions about wind speed. This is, by the way, looking at hurricane impacting a coastal area to determine which assets, the little dots are all individual assets, which assets you might be concerned about for power outage, flooding, or other damage as a result of a hurricane coming into a particular area. So you can make assumptions about wind speed, angle of approach, speed of forward motion. It lets you tell you something about potential assets that might be impacted. It's nice because you can play what-if games and see what might happen if different parameters shift. So on the, yeah, you're right, my right too, right-hand side, you can play with all those different toggles to change all those things based on NOAA inputs or what you might expect in the future. But we can't make the mistake of thinking that the analyst needs is the same as what the decision maker needs are. One of the ladies and I were talking earlier too about, I think there's sort of three groups here. There's the decision makers, there's the analysts, and there's the IT folks that are building these things. Those are three very different groups, and often they're conflated. And the IT folks build something that works great for coders and going in and populating data, but it doesn't work well for analysts to go in and figure out what the heck is going on, and it sure doesn't work well for decision makers who are trying to go in and understand what to do. So I think we need to be very clear about the different needs between those groups and understanding what it is we're trying to accomplish. So fortunately with this particular tool, the gentleman that's working on it actually sent to me unsolicited in his email. He said that he was fine sharing this, but he wanted us to know this is a pre-production tool or something that his analytic team would use, but that would never be seen by a decision maker. And I literally wanted to jump up and cheer because that's exactly the point. This is great for him, it's great for his team, but we can never use it for decision makers. When we went through the hurricane this fall, this is the kind of tool that we had, but we didn't have a way to translate this tool into something that decision makers used. We literally spent hours and hours every day hand jamming this kind of thing into PowerPoint slides that could then be briefed up to the secretary, and then she would often share with Congress, etc., to show what was going on in Puerto Rico and Florida and in Houston. So we, I think, at DHS have a lot of this type of tool. We have much less ability to take this data and put it into something that could be appropriate for decision makers. So I think that is kind of where we are in the process. I've recently seen some early stage visualization projects that are promising in that they interactively display the data and allow decision makers to play what if scenarios like an analyst while the output remains simple. The challenge, though, that I've seen with those tools is that it requires a level of trust of the decision maker. Unless you get into these details, you don't know what is in the black box that is spitting out the results, even if you're changing some of the parameters, etc. So again, I think we have to come back to a community process where we're involving decision makers consistently throughout, so that when they get simplified results at the end, they understand and trust what they have. Otherwise, I think we run a lot of risk there of them not being useful. The way that we've undertaken these efforts is a shared process with policymakers, graphics artists. So a lot of our work has been done technically at DHS by some of the national labs and others. Those folks are engineers, they're coders, they're big thinkers. They don't necessarily do graphics. So we've started pairing for each of those projects with a graphics team right up front. And believe it or not, the national labs actually love this because they feel like they have greater confidence that their products are going to be used. And so we're creating these paired projects now, and they're really just in the infancy stage. I did ask to have a couple screenshots, and I wasn't able to get them, but really promising that we can get to something that's technically sound, that the analytics folks feel really good about, but that is also usable to a wider array of folks. So we're really excited about that. Okay, so I'm interested in these projects because they build customer needs into the project right from the start, into the initial platform development. If we can keep customer needs in mind and not get distracted, these might be data tools that help bridge the divide between the analytic community and decision makers. To wrap up the formal part of our remarks, and I am hoping for a dialogue because I know that these are challenges that we all face, I'd like to lecture you a little bit more on simplicity of presentation and training. In my work, I've definitely found that more is not better in presenting data. The best material that we ended up using for the hurricanes, for example, often was a simple picture, a map with bullets on the side. I mean, the Secretary in Congress, that's what they need. That's what they used, so that they have very clear information about what was going on. Now, it did take literally 12-hour days, a 6-person team to pull things out of maps like this and put it into something like that, and that killed us. But I think it has to be that simple. Okay, let's see. So we have to do our basic homework and understand that what we are trying to accomplish remains the key to success. The more that the analyst understands the decision context and can move beyond the data into the findings and what it means for the decision makers, the more successful the analysis will be. And most analysts can't naturally do that. Analysts tend to like to quietly focus on their numbers, and they often have limited exposure to decision makers. And we can't let that happen. If you have analysts on your team, we have to make them rotate, get out, do policy jobs for a little while, come back, and then be more in their comfort zone. If you're an analyst yourself, we have to engage with decision makers. We have to come to events like this. We have to come to even non-analytic forums and just hear folks talk about policy questions for a while. In my work, when I see an uninspired analyst, I know they have stopped believing that the work they do can save lives. And that is my true belief. I know it's stressful sometimes for my team, but I do tell them that our job is to save lives. Even if what you feel like you're doing is producing a paper, you're informing decisions that will make a real difference. So for us, successful analysis has to be useful analysis. So that's what I have to share with you today. I'm interested in your questions. Jeff, I think you're the moderator. And I'm hoping that I don't have to answer all the questions. You can also help answer questions.
Please introduce yourself as you ask your question.
Thanks, Jen. And thanks for the remarks. My name is Tom Brandon. I'm the Chief Risk Officer for the IRS. So presentation, I think, is very insightful. And actually, many of the charts you produced are ones that I would find quite interesting and useful for myself. But I guess one of the questions I wanted to ask was, I think sometimes the challenge why executives and decision makers oftentimes gravitate to the data and trying to challenge or understand the data is because if there's been instances where the reliability or the quality or the sufficiency of data has come into question, then there's going to be a need to have some assurance that the data that was used to inform the recommendations is sound. So I guess my question is, how do you sort of ensure the reliability and the quality and sufficiency of data that leads to your recommendations and or the presentations for decision makers?
Yeah, that's a great question, because absolutely you would never want to provide misleading or partial data that would result in a non-optimal decision. The challenge for us at DHS, I think, is that our data is always partial, right? So we have a huge data problem, and we were chatting earlier about, we don't have solid data warehouses, et cetera, built within DHS, and so we have a big infrastructure gap, frankly, and we have a data lack. So when things happen, so I'll just use a hurricane since everybody watched that, I'm sure, unfold on TV, et cetera. When things happen, the data that we need is largely not owned by the federal government, and so we end up having to go out and find data either at that moment, or maybe fortunately we've happened to collect it from another source. When we have data from another source, that we've collected previously, it's often partial, and it's not exactly what we need to answer that question that has now emerged. And so there's always gaps for us. And if we, then try to use data from other sources, we have similar challenges where they were collecting it for other sources. During the hurricanes, for example, Gas Buddy became, believe it or not, a huge source of data for FEMA and for NPPD. And that's, not the situation that we would like to be in. We want to have our own data, but we almost never do. And so I think the best we can do is clarify the gaps that we know, right? And just say, here's the limitations that we know we have. Here's how it could skew the data. But we still feel it's solid enough, that we can move forward. I think we have to detail out those assumptions as best we can and hope for the best, frankly.
I have a somewhat related question. So when we teach statistics, we of course talk about the importance of presenting measures of uncertainty, right? You have your point estimate and your standard error. So how do you present uncertainty to the decision maker in such a way that it doesn't sort of cloud the results and sort of conveys your uncertainty without leaving them feeling like they don't know what to do or that they can't make a decision?
Yeah, right. So this is how we did it that time. And this is almost unusable, right? So if you look at so those are logarithmic scales, and if you look at the size of some of those bars, it's almost impossible to make any findings there because the overlap is so substantial. Those, by the way, were I think they were the 15th and 85th percentile on the ends of those, so they could extend, they could extend even beyond the bars. So we've done things like that. If we are trying to simplify it down more, sometimes we will just bullet out to the side of, or underneath the recommendation, to say, this is based on this data. However, here's the data gap that we have, and that could lead to uncertainty in this direction. So we could do it by text. I don't think we've solved that. If others in the room have ways that they've done it that is successful, I would love to hear that, because I don't know the answer myself. The other thing you can do is sensitivity analyses to say, okay, well, if you make these different assumptions, here's how it changes. If you make enough sensitivity analyses, you can then say, okay, well, this finding is robust even should these assumptions change, and that can help, but that takes a little bit of time often to do, and you may or may not have that time. Does anyone in the room have a suggestion? Rick? No, you have another question?
Hi, I'm Rick Saunders. Very interesting presentation, thanks. I'd like to ask you to elaborate a bit more on, if you will, the translation or an integration function that must exist between the decision makers and the analytical processes. And what I'm talking about is how do you, or what is, if you will, the staff function, the decision support functions that ensure that proper connections are being made, understanding what the decision makers really need, which may be a lot different from what they want to, integrating across different disciplines. How do you pull in other analytical sources than the ones we're generating cells. And essentially, how do you do add the art and the understanding and the conceptual framework to the processes you're talking about?
So I don't have the full answer there. I can't claim to crack that nut. I can tell you some things that I think help. So the Office of Cyber and Infrastructure Analysis, where I've just finished my acting detail over there as a deputy director, they made an interesting decision when they hired the current acting director, which is he's not an analyst. He was actually the chief of staff for NPPD for many years before moving into that role, and so he knows the decision-making space more so even than he knows the analytic space. And so he, just by being himself and having the questions and experiences that he has, can help guide the analytic products a little bit more. I think as we bring more people that with diverse experience into the analytic process like that, I think that's really, really positive. We did talk about creating a process for onboarding our new analysts where they would have, actually before they ever came to OCIA, they would have a month in the policy office. So that when they come and they go do analytic work, they know why they're doing it, because they're trying to figure out, you know, what the heck we should be doing about, you know, Russia or China or, you know, some terrorist, because they know there's a real policy question out there that people are trying to figure out. So we're trying to implement things like that. But then there is I think we're making progress on the personnel side. There is a whole process part, though, that you're talking about, where you need that continuous involvement, and that's where I don't think that I know the answer yet. The annual process that we were doing, where we were doing an annual call for, hey, what's your analysis needs for this year, and then we're going to go out and do it, that was not working. We were often producing products a year later that people said, oh, well, you know, I needed that 6 months back, or, you know, whatever, when I first asked for it, and this is not working for me. So that I don't think we have fixed. But I think it's just more of this collaboration in the IPT process where people are coming together in a more continuous dialogue and not just going off in a corner and then producing product.
Let me ask a question, and I'll ask it both of you and of other members of the audience, which is, you said, and it seems intuitively appropriate, it's really important for the decision maker to trust the analyst. In part, they've done a good job. In part, they use the right data. In part, they're communicating in a way that I understand. And of course, they're being responsive to the topics I care about. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, a couple of your slides suggest, well, some of our audiences for the analysis or the decision makers were OMB, Congress, Secretary of Homeland Security. And so my question is kind of how to get the connection and interaction across branches of government or between department and OMB or what have you. And again, I'm curious as to, you know, have you succeeded with that at DHS? And I would actually also like to see whether or not in other agencies, how have you gotten the analyst close to the decision maker? If you have an anecdote you can share.
Mm-hmm. So I don't think that the bridge is so far, actually. So we have a pretty positive relationship with some of the members of our appropriations team, and they have said to us previously, you know, after budget presentations, et cetera, you know, this is how we want to see your data. And they tell us pretty clearly, this is what we want, these are the questions we're asking, this is what we would like you to produce to us. And then we try to do it. So I think, you know, you build those relationships just as you would internally. And yes, sometimes it's a little bit harder. And if you get, you know, an order that requires you to do a particular type of analysis and, you know, produce it to the Hill in 90 days or whatever you might get and pass back if you're very fortunate. You know, you get those and you can't do a lot about them, but in other situations you can have those conversations, and I think we need to do that.
So where you said interaction with the appropriations team, was that Hill staff meeting with your staff and you, or was there some intermediary that kind of...
No, we meet with them directly. So, okay. So we did something in the Office of Infrastructure Protection, so this is now going back into my past roles, but so we created an office called Strategy, Policy and Budget maybe 3 years ago, so that we are specifically bringing together strategy and policy with some of our analytic shop around budget, and that's also the shop that's doing our performance metrics. And so all of that is under me, or was under me. I'm now in a new role. And so I can quickly, if we need a budgetary decision made or we need something happening in performance, I know where we're going strategy and policy-wise, and I can integrate that. And so that's been hugely effective for us. I love that. It's an overwhelming job, frankly, because that spans a huge portfolio of work. But it's been really successful in helping to drive the strategy and policy down into the analytics and down into the budget. So because I'm there at the budget brief, I can have that discussion quite directly. And she says, here's what I need, here's the story, and she can say, what I need from you is something that is compelling to tell my member why he should fund you, and here's what I think would be compelling. And we've had those discussions.
Hi, I'm Joria Badani with REI Systems. One, thank you for a really excellent presentation. Second, the message of the importance of users and user-centered design has certainly been one that has been, I have found, consistent now throughout DHS and the different components that we've worked with. And as industry is being asked more and more through DHS to build prototypes and to show government what we have to offer, my question is, how can we do that successfully when we do not often have access to users? So we've been asked to build things, we've been asked to show things. Certainly your presentation reinforces the importance of having users integrated at every part of the process, particularly in the initial stages. How can we overcome that challenge?
You guys have really good questions. So I'll be super frank. When someone comes and pitches a tool to me as a tool, I'm not interested, right? Because I'm like, I don't need to just buy a tool that I don't need to buy a hammer and then walk around with a hammer looking for a nail, right? I need to have a nail already and then try to figure out what I need to hammer that thing down. And so you have to be able to step somehow into understanding the decisions that are real for the customer at that point in time. I mean, you have to be able to say, here's the decisions that I think this will help you inform, and without that, people aren't going to be interested. I don't think it's all that hard, frankly, to figure out some of the questions, right? I mean, if you're thinking about the cyberspace, you can read the news and know, there is a very active challenge going on with some of our international colleagues. And there's some real questions about what we might want to do about that, right? When you see like the BOD that went out, the Binding Operational Directive for the Kaspersky stuff, it's not a huge stretch to think, well, gosh, they're thinking about these kinds of things and how we might be able to address that. So, I mean, I think that there's a lot that you can capture and just understand by being aware of the policy questions. I think the policy is the most important thing, and that's not restricted to internal discussion.
Another question. So a lot of the focus of your presentation has been on making the analytics accessible to policymakers and decision makers, which seems very reasonable in the political environment that we operate in. But I'm just curious about your opinion about whether there needs to be perhaps more education on the policymaker and decision maker side of things in terms of becoming a little bit more analytics savvy. Maybe this is something that just evolves over time as people move up the ranks, that they will have had more analytic training, either through higher education or through on-the-job experience. So I guess what I'm wondering is, do you think that, I feel like you're trying to meet them where they are. Do you think they need to perhaps move a little bit as well, or not?
I mean, it would be ideal if we could meet in the middle, but I don't think that's practical. I'm just being honest, right? Like people are put in positions because for a lot of different reasons, and having the skill set to lead a really large organization isn't necessarily the same skill set as looking at an analytic process in detail. And I don't think we're going to be able to handpick those people. We actually at NPPD have probably the most analytically savvy leadership team that we've had in a while right now, and that's been really helpful and definitely came into play. I mean, there were huge interest and thirst for analytics during the hurricanes and just trying to understand what was happening, which was great, but that's just not always going to be the case. And even with that, there's still such an imperative on us to make it accessible to them, because they're coming in new at the most senior levels. They're coming in new to an organization that they don't know well. It's going to take them some time to get up to speed, and we just have to recognize that. At the more mid-level management, yes, I think they can have a higher expectation for familiarity with the data, et cetera, but the more up the chain you go, I don't see that changing.
So it's really nice to hear your message about having the analytic team engage with the customer and try and focus the communication, especially in a way that's convenient to the customer. Some of us who've been in this arena for a while are familiar with the term a self-licking ice cream cone, which is kind of an analyst who does the analysis in order to kind of entertain themselves, and there's actually no outside person ever kind of consuming it. But it also makes me think of a presentation that we had, I think, 4 months ago on artificial intelligence. Now let me just kind of trot out a hypothetical. Let's say, for example, machine learning or artificial intelligence were being used by your team, and it found a connection, I'm just making this up, that, you know what, heavy opioid use is prominent amongst all of the active shooters. Mm-hmm. No analysis customer ever thought to ask that question, is there a connection? And in fact, no analyst ever thought to ask it either. But when you kind of use artificial intelligence to mash up the data and look for patterns that no one would have imagined, you find a pattern that might be very important. Mm-hmm. So my question is kind of, is there room for that? How should that kind of, hey, you didn't ask for this, but we found it for you. Mm-hmm. How should that be presented? And then finally, has something like that arisen in your experience?
These are all really great questions. I love this. Very, very good point. So I would say two things. Yes, I think that could happen, and yes, it has happened for us before that we are looking at data and say, interesting, we found this and we think it's relevant. Now, in order for that to work right now, what needs to happen is that the analyst has to know the policy environment they're sitting in. Otherwise, they will never know if they see something interesting, right? So that you could find 10 different random correlations, only one of which is actually relevant to policymaker, and the analyst needs to be able to decipher which is which. So I think we still need to have the educated analyst in the loop right now. Now, in the future, could you create a wider library of correlations that could be novel and identified by artificial intelligence? Yes. We are very far from that in terms of the data capability that we have. We are starting to look at, how can we improve the data elements that we're capturing and make sure that we have a much wider array of data, but it's going to take us a while to get there. And until you have the data, artificial intelligence can only do so much, right? It has to look at something, and you have to have the something for it to look at, and I don't think we have it, at least in our space right now. I don't know if in other agencies there's a little bit more data to work with, but I would say we are woefully under-resourced in terms of data for us.
So that brings to my mind a question, and again, it's kind of illustrative, taking advantage of the couple of you who are here in the room. I know that occasionally federal agencies are a little hesitant to share their data with with the public and with other agencies for good reason often. You don't want to be sharing data that will make very clear where are the most prominent vulnerabilities, for example. And Tom's agency, the IRS, doesn't want to share information that kind of discloses confidential taxpayer information. But occasionally, I wonder, for example, if you, for some reason or another, there was some information that the IRS has that says, the most prominent vulnerabilities might be in companies X or Y or industry Z. Let's say for some way or another, Tom or his team figured that out. Would they be able to share it with you? And I guess more prominently for you, are there places where you go kind of inquire outside DHS, but to other federal agencies or even state local agencies, hey, what are your analytic needs? Mm-hmm. So how often does kind of the customer of the analysis involve folks who are either outside DHS or it's kind of immediate supervisory chain of OMB and the Congress?
Mm-hmm. So quite often I would say we interact and ask for data outside of DHS. So within infrastructure protection, you may know there's 16 sectors that cover the breadth of what we think of as critical infrastructure, and that includes things like water and roads and energy and stuff. And there are there is a Department of Energy, and there is a Department of Transportation, and there is EPA, right? So we work extremely closely with those entities, and in fact, there's a designation as a sector-specific agency for the different agencies that are most closely aligned with some of these sectors. And then our job is to kind of look nationwide, you know, across all of those sectors, et cetera. So in order to do that, we have to have super close relationships with all of those entities, and we do share data. So Department of Energy, to use them as an example, maintains an Eagle Eye system that monitors current outages across the U.S. so that they can track, you know, where there might be a challenge with electricity following an incident. And we do not create our own data for that kind of information. We use their data. And so, yeah, so we have those relationships in place, but that doesn't mean that there aren't challenges, right? So it takes a while to get an MOA in place to use Eagle Eye, and then it has taken years of relationship building and working on processes to understand who's going to brief the data when, because, you know, in the early stages, there were instances where, you know, the DHS representative, in the case of an incident, briefed the Department of Energy data, and they were not happy about that. And so, you know, there's a lot of process and a lot of community building and work to get those things in place. And for something, you know, like IRS that we may not have that routine engagement with, it would be challenging for us to share data. There would be, you know, quite some processes to work through there. We do have the capability to protect uniquely some of the information that we collect, either from particular owners and operators or from, if it's related to a cyber incident or cyber traffic. We do have some unique data protection capabilities that are intended to ease some of that, but it still remains challenging. It's a huge bureaucratic system, as you all know.
So my presumption, though, is that if you found some nefarious foreign country acting to try and compromise the IRS and our ability to kind of maintain confidentiality or collect taxes, you would be able at least to go and share that kind of this threat to Tom and his team. Okay, good. Tyrion?
Yeah, my question is, are there any success stories that you would want to share or highlight? And then more broadly, is there anything that you would advise for industry in this role to help you create that success? Like, what does success really look like, and how can industry help you achieve that within this framework that you outlined?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there are two success stories that come to mind, both of which are some time ago. So, you know, I'm sure there's more recent ones, but there was an incident, and I'm going to have to be general on this one. There was a concern about some threat streams that were out there, and there was a high-level senior meeting that came together to say, okay, what are we going to do about this? Frankly, you know, we can conceive of options A, B, and C. We've got, you know, essentially 30 days to decide which of these options are we going to do. And so we went off and did a cost-benefit analysis as best we could in the time given, and presented back, you know, here's what we think the risk buy-down is for each of these options. Here's what we think the cost, economic, direct and indirect, will be, and here's challenges for implementation. Laid it out, made a recommendation, the decision was made, and it was implemented. I think that works very well when you have a short time frame, high priority, very scoped and defined problem, and everybody's involved, right? I mean, it was pretty high profile, and so there was just a very, like, we're going to decide, and here's the time we're going to decide, and here's how we're going to get it, and it went really well. And that was implemented, made a difference in their world. So I'm super proud about that, and I can't be more specific than that. The other example I can think of is also similarly scoped a while back. You know, we were asked by another component within DHS, you know, we want to think about how we deploy our resources most effectively. Can you help us work through this process? We want to look at risk buy-down, basically, to think about where we put our folks. And again, you know, staff went out to the field. They met with the folks in the field, worked through some things while they were out there for the course of the week to make sure that it would work for them. Came up with some decision processes and criteria for them to decide, you know, how they were going to best do this, and it was implemented. And it was, you know, everybody felt really good about it. In both of those cases, huge team effort and very scoped problem with a short time frame. Those have been the easiest. When you get these big, unclear questions, that's when I think we struggle. So I think the more we can scope it, the better, in my opinion. How does industry help us with that? There's different skill sets needed along the way. I think all of those skill sets are valid.
Let's have one last question.
My name is Paresh. I'm from NetTrust Business Consulting. We are currently doing data analytics at CVP and would like to understand what kind, or if you can share, what kind of tools you're currently using to do the analytics.
I probably don't have a comprehensive list, so I can't really give you. For us, a lot of them are housed at the national labs, and so some of it is proprietary. Yeah, I mean, we use things like Tableau and R and other things like that, but a lot of it has ended up being proprietary over the years.
Subhash Ghai, Chief Technology Officer at ARIA. When you were describing your model about the different users, right? You mentioned about the IT organization, the organization that is supporting the analysis, and then the decision makers. I'm curious that what advice would you give to the leaders of the organizations who want to make their operational staff more productive using data? What are some of the programs or initiatives that you think can help improve organizational maturity to consume data, for an average worker?
I guess I would ask that leader where they think the areas of inefficiency are right now, so that we could hone in on that in terms of data collection, right? I think there's a lot of interest right now in data for data's sake, right? Without a lot of understanding of why we're trying to get the data, and that's what I want to avoid. I haven't seen that be very successful now. So what I would want to say is, let's focus a little bit more and understand what it is that we're trying to actually achieve before we dive in.
So I think that's going to have to conclude for today. Please join me in thanking Sarah Ellis P. from the Department of Homeland Security for your thoughtful presentation. I hope that those of you who are interested will come and join us on June 12th when Tom Brandt, the Chief Risk Officer for the Internal Revenue Service, will come and speak with us about using analytics to analyze, evaluate, and act on risk to the agency as a whole. So thank you for coming. Please feel free to stick around, have a little bit more breakfast, visit with each other. The purpose of these events is for you to get to know members of the community. Thank you again.
Thank you for your questions. They were excellent.